Verify exists to fact-check the suspicious things you see online. A viewer reached out after seeing a Facebook post like this one. It's being copy and pasted all over, claiming to be from an anonymous Australian nurse. The message warns that you should not allow yourself or your kids to have an infrared thermometer pointed at your forehead, claiming it could harm part of the brain called the pineal gland. So let's verify. Is there any evidence infrared thermometers damage the pineal gland? Our sources here are the Food and Drug Administration and experts in neuroradiology, endocrinology, and fire protection engineering.
These detectors don't emit any infrared light, so that, to me, is not an issue.
Peter Sunderland from the University of Maryland says these thermometers measure infrared light to determine how hot something is. He says some thermometers may emit a dim red light, but that's just a guide for the person taking your temperature. The FDA, who regulates the sale of medical devices in the US, agrees that infrared thermometers do not emit any infrared energy. So did Dr. Harris Sire, Director of Neuroradiology at Johns Hopkins Medicine. He says nothing happens between the thermometer and the pineal gland. We also spoke with Dr. Sabyasachi Sen at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. He said infrared thermometers are a, quote, vital test for screening, especially during a pandemic.
I don't know where is the scientific basis for this concern. In absence of that, it's a conjecture, it's innuendo.
So we could verify that at this point, there's no evidence that infrared thermometers can damage the pineal gland. With your